So let's get straight to it. It's been a full week since XRP Australia Sydney that was held at the Crown Hotel by the Wave of Innovations team. And like the Crown Hotel in Sydney that has redesigned the limits of the skyline of CBD of City, the conference also proved to expand horizons and perspectives of all of those in attendance. And I was thankfully lucky enough to have a brief connection with Brad and then a deeper connection with David. I wish to go into depth with what that 20 minutes with the creator was like. And David used the Schwartz. I just want to say thank you for being so approachable and giving of yourself freely and vehemently to all that engaged with you. It was a great chance just to meet the heroes that make up Ripple and the XRPL, and chance to meet the people who are making a dent in the universe. It would be remiss of me before launching into that to not and thank again David's partner who generous give of her time to me, and I just want to say thanks again for that. That prelude led into a symphony, and the symphony began off with David being very smooth and a little bit understated, with giving me a bit more joviality when we mentioned the first part of our conversation, which was that yes, Australia is a real place. Because he had his queries about if a land filled with convicts was even a real place. But once we got through that, I did pass on my admiration to him for the work he's done with NSA, the Bitcoin Ledger, and all the hard yards that he's put in over the years, building out solutions that are going to change humanity forever. When David heard that, he definitely lit up a little bit. David's humor also was on display throughout the day, as well as in my conversation, which, as I mentioned, started with is Australia a real place? I did notice that I mentioned he was giving freely of his time, and he did so before my conversation with a budding journalist who had prepared what looked like several pages A4 documentation, and he patiently went through it, sat down with her, and went through every question. Our conversation began with Arthur Britto, and with great humility, David said he's the genius, he's a savant, and he can fluently come to an understanding and a conclusion, whereas me, you, and everyone else have to sequence a process and then logically regale it to someone to arrive at the same conclusion. However, it must be noted, David, that even Dustin Hoffman had a Tom Cruise in The Rain Man. I think, that's a pretty good duo. The next part of the conversation was guided heavily by understanding about what the devs are working through in Ripple today. And I thank Joel, from the senior developer from Singapore, who was working on the Ripple merchandising desk, and all of the team were open to communicate and collaborate with the public throughout the day. And they just want to spruce the public's curiosity. So thank you, Joel, because it really led into the second and the third part of the conversations with David. The second part was primarily around the refactoring of the XRPL code base from C++ to Rust. And the way in which they have to do that is they have to find each portion, be it a name class or a argument, and rather than dig down into how is actually coded, they want to understand the what it's trying to achieve. And having that as a library repository of code analysis would allow the teams to thoroughly break down and then rewrite the XRPL in Rust without making any mistakes. It's definitely not a copy and paste into Claude. And I just want to apologize to David if I butcher this next part, but third part was about zero knowledge proof, and that is what I will spend the majority of this content talking about today. It is the biggest question that the team are leaning into, and it's simply put like this. If a node falls out of sync, you will never be able to theoretically get back in line with the correct ledger syncing up with it unless you had zero knowledge in place. Why? Because you could introduce 50 to 100 rules like a Bible or commandments, and that node that's out of sync could look at the current ledger and go, oh, did it adhere to these 50 or 100 particular commandments or rules? Okay, it did. Well, I can take those transactions with a grain of salt and just fall back into sync. These things would preserve the network-wide strain on the XRPL, and it would retain trustless verification. If you fell out of sync and then utilized these 50 to 100 rules, one of them would be, for example, I asked David to give me an example. He said, okay, did it create any more XRP? There's 100 billion. We know how many are burnt. We know how many are not burnt. Did it create any new ones? No? Okay, that's one tick. It dawned on me that there could be potentially 1 in a million, or as he said, 99% of the time it doesn't happen, but 0.1% of the time this does happen. It could be that at some stage we do have current ledgers validating against those rules, but then there's conflicting historical accounts on ledgers, and there's an unresolved issue, and it's the biggest issue that is facing the teams in Ripple X, Ripple Labs, Ripple Commons, David himself. I mean, pragmatically fine, but the nuance is what if that conflicting one transaction is $1 billion transaction? A 0.01% chance sounds negligible until you frame it properly at that scale. That small percentage represents real events, not theoretical ones. The value of the transaction is entirely independent of the probability of that single conflicting transactions being $1 billion. So where does that leave you? It leaves you in a situation where the zero knowledge proof has done its job. It's performed as required, but you still have a non-homogenic ledger, which is a worry, because if ever 20% or less than 80% of all validators are in sync, protocol stops, it halts. So it is a big technical problem that they are trying to address, but it's more than a technical problem, really. It's a social governance problem. Like in the real world, who arbitrates this? Who states which ledger is canonical? And what if the protocol can't answer that and states they're both rule compliant? To give you an example, I thought this through. It's like me holding a notarized deed and then you holding a notarized deed to the same house. The law, not the notaries, will have to resolve it. Lots of things to the law. And I think that's where this might lead to some sort of, council or panel that look and evaluate and then have to make a human judgment on a protocol. Very interesting conundrum. And it's one that I wish the best to David and the team in solving. And it's one that sometimes the best minds that money can buy and the best minds that money can't buy are at odds to try and figure out. And to hear this dilemma from the greatest cryptographic mind of our generation, and indeed the one who built, in my idea, the best blockchain out there, was a privilege that I will hold on to for the rest of my life. We don't get this out here in Australia. You got to remember, we got spiders and sharks. We got nothing, and snakes. That's it. We never get Schwartz. So, I have to say the next part of the conversation was also epic. I mentioned from my trawlings through X and my memory of a security engineer who unfortunately has recently passed. And as David figured out who I was referring to, I believe his name is Daniel, he lit up and he became extremely energized because, it wasn't just him now trying to find the weaknesses in the ledger. It was other kindred spirits and minds who can attack the XRPL in the same way to expose things that David would think about. And I think, having those sorts of minds and having people that see things the way you do invigorates one's soul, so you can riff on issues like the zero knowledge proof one, and you're not alone in the stewardship of the greatest technology of mankind, well, definitely the greatest technology of the financial system of mankind, into the next hands. I think that must offer some semblance of, comfort, people that are equally as gifted as you. And now, with so many people gathered around and this riveting conversation getting deeper and deeper, I felt as if David started speaking in a metaphor through the next part of the conversation. He spoke of a friend. This friend is an economic master. He has won the equivalent of what I to understand is the Nobel Prize for economists. And David would say that in conversations with this man, even though David may have known more about a specific paper or a more nuanced detail or fact, or maybe totally is on the right track with an idea, and his friend not, didn't matter, because his friend was more intelligent and could lead the conversation wherever he wanted. And it was at this moment, I think, David Schwartz sort of took on the figure of Larry Bird, one of the Boston Celtics greats, an NBA Hall of Famer, who would be able to tell you where he was going to take you on the court and then tell you how he was going to score on you. And I probably am reading too far into that, but it was definitely a 4D chess moment with, the maker of XRPL Ledger. I learned also from the start of the day, someone else had NBA passions, so I've included that epilogue there in this content. People always ask me and always say, what will you do when you meet your maker? Still don't know, but I do know what I'll say next time I meet the XRP maker, and no doubt I'll have to read up on my inside jokes and riddles. I wanted to leave that with you as the last part of the conversation. David Schwartz is exactly as smart as you would think in your wildest dreams. He's on top of all the riddles. He sees everything. And, such is the speed of his brain and computational energy. And indeed, possibly the chemical reactions that are happening in his brain are at the forefront and the very edge of what is possible for a human. That's his native state of play, baby. And he notices all things, whether you are a bit lackluster in your conversation or using filler words. And yet this formidable and daunting mind and intellect is abridged and softened with a deep sense of humility and humanity. And that is imbued down into his mentees. As mentioned, Joel, but also head of engineering at RippleX, who I also spoke to, Mr. Io, pronunciation like ionized. You would be surprised where your conversations with these people will end up. So I do ask you that you need to prepare because it's a mental gymnastic maneuver. And a thank you to Brad, who I had a much more truncated meeting with on the blue carpet. A massive thanks to the entire Ripple team and all the people that went together, from the security to the logistics to the people that worked on the desk and the mediators and people that were on as key speakers. Thank you to Wave of Innovation for the tireless work they did, mediating and liaising and preparing a rare opportunity for all Australian attendees and others who came from New Zealand and people came from Southeast Asia. Thank you, Sadaf, for putting on a fantastic event. Thank you to the Master of Ceremonies, Wayneswar, and thank you to all the attendees who connected with me. And I hope and look forward to seeing you all, as Ashish Burla has said, in London 2027. Catch you on the flip side.